Today we're focusing on the iconic Contemptor pattern Dreadnought. The modern-style Contemptor Dreadnought made its debut in 2011 during the tale of Forge World's Imperial armor, the Bad Dab War, first showcased in the colors of the Astral Claws. The initial release featured the standard Contemptor Dreadnought, followed shortly by the Relic Contemptor. Much like Forge World's popular Mark IV Dreadnoughts, these models were sold with weapon arms as separate kits, allowing collectors to customize their loadouts to suit their needs. When the Horus Heresy launched as a dedicated game system in 2012, Forge World expanded the Contemptor range by introducing Legion-specific variants. These unique chassis incorporated distinctive elements of each Legion's identity and quickly became iconic models in Horus Heresy collections. In 2015, with the release of Betrayal at Calth, the first plastic Contemptor Dreadnought was introduced. While part of an exciting release, this kit was limited by its monopose design and a narrow selection of weapon options, leaving many hobbyists wanting more. Fast forward to 2022, the launch of the Horus Heresy, Age of Darkness, brought a massive upgrade to the plastic Contemptor Dreadnought. This updated kit featured enhanced detail, improved posability, and a much wider array of weapon options. However, the Legion-specific Contemptor Dreadnoughts were unfortunately discontinued, with their distinctive designs reduced to torso upgrades intended for use with the new plastic kit. It is this updated Contemptor kit that we will be focusing on in our painting guide. For this project, we'll be painting one for the Imperial Fists Legion, showcasing their striking inverted color scheme. I begin by clipping parts off the sprues and cleaning them with a hobby knife, focusing first on the legs and torso. When assembling, I always start from the bottom and work my way upward. Beginning with the feet allows me to establish a strong, planted pose, which sets the foundation for the model's overall stance. For this build, I'm intentionally keeping one of the knee pads separate, as it will be painted a different color from the rest of the body. Next, I move on to prepping the torso. I've chosen to keep the head surround armor off for now, as the head will be painted a different color and added later. This approach ensures clean and precise painting of the individual components. I've also kept certain parts separate to make them easier to paint. For example, some pieces will be spray painted silver, while others will remain unattached to simplify brushing the silver onto the chassis. With the legs and torso prepped, I turn my attention to the arms and weapons, following the same process of careful cleaning, assembly, and planning for efficient painting. We have our Dreadnought prepped for paint. I've also kept the power pack separate. I can spray paint it and save time. The shoulders are still separate as well, since they'll be painted in different colors than the chassis. Similarly, the minor armor panels remain off for the same reasons. Finally, we have the Volkite Dual Culverin, which will also be spray painted silver along with the power pack. I start by priming the components with Chaos Black Spray, covering the body, minor armor panels, part of the Havoc launcher, and any components we want to keep black or paint silver later. Next, I switch to Wraithbone Spray to prime all the parts intended to be yellow. This provides a great base for Imperial Fists. Finally, I use Lead Belcher Spray to prime all the components that will remain silver. Now that everything is primed, we have three distinct groups: black components, silver components, and Wraithbone primed parts. It's time to move on to the airbrush. I start with Vallejo Air Anthracite Gray and airbrush all of our black surfaces. This is the same method and colors I use for painting my Raven Guard. I then use Vallejo Air Sun Yellow and paint all of our yellow parts. I let all of them dry, and then using Seraphim Sepia Wash, I airbrush a light layer onto our yellow. This will add warmth and give a nice variation to our yellow. I return to our black parts and do a similar layer using Nolan Oil to darken the anthracite gray and make everything take a more black appearance. Here you can see our three groups ready for brushwork. Starting with Ironbreaker and an old brush, I paint the Contemptor's chassis. This is my least favorite part of any Contemptor. It's time-consuming and ruins brushes. I just hate it. I also paint the ball joints on the inside of the arms. I then switch to a finer brush and paint the small silver details on the chassis before moving on to the yellow group and painting the details on the head, Havoc launcher, and Gravis Power Fist with inbuilt Plasma Blaster. I then use Khorne Red and carefully paint the Dreadnought's eyes, fully taking advantage of the head still being a separate piece. I then paint the targeter lens on the Volkite Dual Culverin before painting all of the rockets in the Havoc launcher. Next, using Mephiston Red, I highlight all of the Khorne Red painted in the previous step. I clip off and clean our Havoc launcher, and then use Abaddon Black to touch up the clipping point. I paint the hanging cables on the Volkite Dual Culverin. I then use Runelord Brass and paint the brass details and muzzle of our Contemptor's main armament. I clip off and clean the Cod armor and touch it up with Eshin Gray. I then touch up any Iron Breaker brush slips on our black armor before doing a dry brush highlight over our Volkite Dual Culverin's cables. I finish with a loose highlight over the black plating on the Havoc launcher. We can now glue on the power pack and Cod armor and assemble our Havoc launcher. Using Retributor armor, I return to our Volkite Dual Culverin and do a dry brush highlight over our brass. Then, using Nuln Oil, I wash down all of her silver. This is a transformative step. The wash will sink into the recesses and give our bright silver chassis a more defined and realistic look. I wash down silver paint on our Havoc launcher, arms, Gravis Power Fist, and the Volkite Dual Culverin, including the brass and black cables. Now, we can trim and clean the smaller armor panels we set aside earlier and begin attaching them to the Contemptor's body. Since I want this Dreadnought to be firing its Volkite Dual Culverin, I'll start with the main weapon arm, followed by the head. Be sure to position the head so its eyeline aligns with the direction of fire. Once the head is secured, we can attach the surrounding armor. Next, I add the power plant armor before moving on to the Havoc launcher, finishing the assembly with the Gravis Power Fist. Next, I use Wraithbone to touch up any brush slips and clean up areas where we clipped the yellow panels. Then, I switch to a sponge for light weathering along the edges of the yellow armor, keeping it subtle to add minor texture and simulate light scratches in the paint. After that, I move to Eshin Gray and apply the same sponge weathering technique to the black armor panels, creating a lightly worn effect. This is just the first stage of weathering. We'll be adding more toward the end of the project. Now it's time for transfers. Since this Dreadnought features an inverted color scheme, I want to make it unmistakably Imperial Fists. I chose a large fist icon for the chest as a focal point. For the leg greaves, I selected 2 large veteran crosses with a smaller one for one of the knee pads. The other knee pad will get an eagle for balance. Lastly, I chose the Legion numeral and Legion icons for the shoulders to further reinforce its Legion identity. To apply the transfers, I first soak them in water until they loosen. I then use Walther's Solvaset and wet the target surface before I lift the transfer into place with a brush. I then use my hobby knife to make small adjustments to align the transfer into its final position. Once all of the transfers have been placed and are fully dry, I apply a second coat of Walther's Solvaset over the top to help the transfers settle down over the contours of the armor plates. With the second layer of Walther's Solvaset dry, I return to Iron Breaker and do a sponge weather over the edges and areas of our armor plating that would receive the most wear and tear. This second layer of weathering will simulate more recent light battle damage. To make the flat 60mm base look more like uneven earth, I use green stuff and apply some small clumps to the base. While the green stuff cures, we can start working with oils. I use a mix of brown Abteilung oils, thinning a small amount with odorless thinner. Using an old brush, I carefully dab the mixture into armor recesses, cracks, and around rivets. The oil naturally settles into these details, adding depth and a realistic layer of battlefield grime and dirt. If the application is too heavy or too light, you can easily adjust it by removing excess with thinner or adding more oil as needed. Once you're happy with the weathering, allow everything to fully dry before moving on to basing. I base my entire collection in a plain dirt style, which enhances realism while providing a neutral backdrop that makes the Legion's bright colors stand out. Keeping all my models based in the same way unifies the collection, visually grounding them in a shared setting. This consistency also allows me to seamlessly integrate allies or form shattered Legion forces into armies while maintaining a cohesive look across the entire force. Using PVA glue and an old paintbrush, I brush the glue onto the base. I then dip the base in a fine sand mix. Make sure the sand is fully covering the glue. You can use a finger and wipe off any sand hanging over the lip of the base. I let the base dry and then paint over the sand with a generous coat of Citadel Dryad bark. I go pretty heavy on the Dryad bark. It will dry down onto the sand and further help fix it onto the base. Next, I dry brush Citadel Mournfang Brown over the sand. Then I do a final dry brush of Citadel Ushabti Bone. Using Reikland Flesh Shade, I do a generous wash. This helps blend the different shades of brown. I paint the rim of the base with Citadel Steel Legion Drab. Usually it takes 2 coats to get even coverage. Next, I apply weathering powders to the Dreadnought's lower legs and base to simulate dust and dirt kicked up as it moves across the battlefield, helping to ground the model into its environment. Once the weathering is in place, I seal everything with Tester's Dull Coat to ensure a uniform matte finish and provide essential protection for the paint, especially important for a model that will see tabletop action. After sealing, I return to the airbrush and use Vallejo concrete to apply a very fine layer of dust on the Dreadnought's feet and greaves, further enhancing the weathered, battle-worn effect. Our Contemptor is now complete and ready to defend Bastion Aleph Prime in the upcoming 3rd installment of the Siege of Chthoniya narrative series. I want to take a moment to thank all of my Patreon supporters. Your support and feedback are invaluable to the channel. Every contribution goes directly into models and scenery to bring these projects to life. I also want to thank everyone for watching. Your comments, feedback, and shares have been instrumental in helping the channel grow. One of the most common questions I get is, when's the next Siege of Chthoniya episode coming?